What if the place you're most afraid of is the one you can't remember? Deep in the woods stands a mansion that doesn't want you to leave. A group of friends, drawn by the eerie whispers of a dark legend, steps inside, only to discover that the house isn't just abandoned, it erases. It devours memories. Faces fade. With every passing hour, they lose more than time. They lose themselves. The house is alive, pulling them deeper into its endless, suffocating darkness. The worst part? They were never meant to leave. Will they remember who they are before it's too late, or will they vanish into the house's forgotten history? Enter, if you dare. But beware, once it claims you, you'll be lost forever. I do not remember when I first heard of the mansion, nor do I recall who first spoke of it. Yet, the tale clung to my thoughts like cobwebs in an ancient hall, light, insidious, and impossible to remove. They say it stands deep within the withering woods, a place where no paths lead, a place one stumble upon only by chance, or by fate. And they say, those who forget their past can never return. A superstition, no doubt. A simple legend passed through trembling lips on cold, moonless nights. But something about it troubled me, something I could not quite grasp, as if the words were not merely spoken to me but remembered by me. Even now, I struggle to recall the first time I saw it. Was it in a dream? A half-forgotten memory? Or had I already been there, my footsteps erased by time itself? The thought sent an unnatural shiver through me. There were gaps, small fractures in my recollection, brief moments where my past blurred at the edges. I would reach for a memory only to find it hollow, as if something had taken its place, something dark and waiting. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were distant, a murmur beneath the rustling trees, the hush of leaves swaying in the wind. Yet, no wind blew. The air was still, thick with something unseen, something watching. The voices were not voices, not truly. They were remnants of sound, syllables just beyond comprehension. I listened, straining, and though I could not decipher the words, I understood them. They called for me. My nights became restless. Sleep eluded me, dissolving into feverish half-dreams where shadows moved without form, and unseen hands brushed against my skin. The mansion loomed in my mind, taking shape in those endless hours, its decayed walls, its yawning windows like empty sockets in a skull. It wanted me to find it. It needed me to remember. One evening, as dusk stretched long and thin across the sky, I found myself walking. I did not know where I was going, my legs carried me as if moved by another's will. The town faded behind me, swallowed by the encroaching woods. I had never wandered this far before, and yet I knew the way. The path twisted beneath my feet, winding through a forest that should not exist, where the trees stood too still, their branches curling inward like skeletal fingers. The sky darkened, though the sun had not yet set. The air hummed with something unspoken, something waiting. And then I saw it. The mansion stood before me, just as I had imagined, just as I had remembered. Tall and crumbling, its facade was veiled in dusk's fading light, its windows black and depthless. A terrible familiarity seized me. I had been here before, I knew I had, but when? Why? And why, standing there at the threshold, did I feel as though I had never truly left? It was with a hesitant resolve that I found myself leading our small band of 4 toward the mansion's yawning threshold. My companions, Thomas, ever the skeptic, Margaret, her curiosity piqued beyond reason, and William, whose silence betrayed a fear he would never admit, followed with the apprehensive gait of those who suspect they tread upon the cursed ground. The mansion loomed before us, a monument to decay and desolation, its once grand architecture now a skeletal mockery of life. The walls, clad in a sickly, peeling gray, seemed to shudder beneath the weight of their own rot, and the windows, like darkened eyes, stared back at us with a dreadful, vacant regard. There was no life here, no birds sang, no insects chirped, and not even the wind dared disturb the oppressive stillness that hung thick as fog. And yet, as we approached, I felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, an unshakable certainty that we were not alone. Something watched us, unseen yet intimately close, its gaze a weight that pressed down upon my chest, making each breath shallow and strained. We reached the door, a hulking slab of wood warped and twisted by time, its iron knocker rusted and cold beneath Thomas's hand as he lifted it. The knock echoed, a hollow sound that seemed to reverberate not through the air, but within our very minds, a disturbance in the quiet of our thoughts. We waited, the silence swelling around us like a living thing, thick and suffocating. No answer came. Impatience tinged with dread drove William to the door, his hand pressing against its splintered surface. The moment his skin met the wood, his entire body stiffened, his eyes wide and unseeing, mouth parting in a silent scream. It was as though the house had reached into him, plucking at the strings of his mind, unraveling his thoughts. We watched, paralyzed, as his hand slid down, leaving a smear of cold sweat in its wake. And then, with a groan like a dying beast, the door moved. It swung inward, not by our hand, but by some unseen force, its hinges shrieking in protest, the sound a dagger plunged into the heart of the silence. Darkness yawned beyond the threshold, a blackness so complete it seemed to consume the light around it, swallowing the last rays of the sun that dared to touch the doorway. Compelled by a force I could neither name nor resist, I stepped forward, crossing into the abyss. My friends followed, their movements stilted, as though drawn by invisible strings. The air within was heavy, thick with the scent of mold and something fouler, decay, ancient and profound. The door slammed shut behind us, sealing us in with a finality that echoed through the cavernous halls. In that moment, as the last sliver of light was snuffed out, I understood with a chilling clarity, we had been claimed by the house, and whatever waited within its walls would not let us leave unchanged, if at all. The moment the door closed behind us, a strange and suffocating stillness enveloped us. The mansion was no longer just a structure of stone and wood, it had become something else, alive, pulsing, breathing. The walls seemed to shift, ever so slightly, in and out, as though the house itself was inhale and exhale, drawing us deeper into its vast and suffocating belly. I could feel it, the weight of the house, pressing against my chest, my lungs constricting as though it were a living thing, hungry for our presence. Every footstep, every movement seemed to stir the house, as if we were not intruders, but mere breaths of air, drawn in and swallowed by its dark, greedy maw. Thomas, Margaret, and William were equally unnerved, but none of us spoke, none of us dared to voice the thoughts that scratched and clawed at the edges of our minds. We wandered aimlessly through the hallways, each room darker than the last, each doorway narrower, as though the house were slowly folding itself in on us. I could not remember how much time had passed, or where we had wandered. The house had a way of making the world outside seem distant, irrelevant. And worse still, our memories, our names, our histories, began to slip away, like water between the fingers. I had once known who I was, had once seen the faces of my family, had once spoken words that felt true. But now I could barely recall my own name, the details of my life growing fainter, like the whisper of wind in an empty room. "Who are you again?" Margaret's voice cut through the fog of my thoughts, though the words were distant, detached. She was standing before me, her face pale and drawn, but there was something in her eyes, a faint glimmer of recognition that felt as fragile as a dying ember. Her words trembled on her lips, a slow, deliberate question that sent a chill crawling down my spine. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. Only a vague sense of familiarity, as if I had known her once, but the memory had become frayed, unraveling before me. My hands trembled as I looked at them, but they too seemed strange, not mine, alien, as though they had never held anything but air. It was then that I saw it. In the corner of the room, half hidden beneath layers of dust, stood an old, tarnished mirror. I stepped toward it, drawn by some nameless force, and as I gazed into its surface, my reflection was not there. Nothing stared back at me, no eyes, no face, only the blackened emptiness of the glass, stretching deeper, wider than it should. My heart stopped. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I saw him. An elderly figure, hunched and cloaked in shadows, stood in the far corner of the room. His face was hidden, obscured beneath the folds of a tattered coat, but I could feel his presence, a weight in the air that pressed down on me with crushing force. "You have all been here before," he whispered, his voice as thin as the air around us. "And you never returned." Before I could respond, a piercing scream cut through the house, high and raw, followed by an eerie silence. We turned to find that William, who had stood beside me just moments ago, was gone, vanished as though the house had simply devoured him, leaving behind only the hollow echo of his scream. Our hearts raced, and panic surged within me. But as I looked around, I realized something far worse. I no longer remembered his face. Panic, once a distant whisper in the back of our minds, had now become an overwhelming storm. The mansion, with its suffocating silence and its oppressive, living walls, seemed to close in on us. We moved through its vast, labyrinthine halls, our breaths shallow and ragged, as if the very air had conspired against us. Each room, each hallway, seemed more familiar than the last, as though we had passed through them time and again, though I could not recall when or why. There were no answers, only the gnawing sense that we were being erased, one fleeting moment at a time. It was Margaret who found it, the ledger. She stood in the center of an abandoned study, dust swirling around her like some ethereal dance, when she cried out. We rushed to her side, and there, on an old, rotting desk, lay a tattered book. Its pages were yellowed, brittle, and torn in places. As she opened it, the sight made my blood run cold. The names were there, our names, written in faded ink, but something was wrong. Each name had been scratched out, violently, with an almost deliberate malice. I reached for the page, my fingers trembling, and traced the remnants of my own name, barely visible beneath the angry streaks of ink. "What does this mean?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with fear, as if saying the words aloud might make it real. I don't know," I whispered, my mind racing. It was as if we had never existed here. As if we had been removed, erased, before we ever had a chance to leave a mark. The walls, the floors, the house itself seemed to conspire to strip us of our essence, to unwrite us from history. A low groan reverberated through the room, followed by an unsettling crackling noise. We spun toward the sound, our hearts leaping into our throats. In the corner of the room, near a dilapidated window, William stood. Or at least, he seemed to be standing. There was something terribly wrong, his form was fading, dissolving into the air like smoke slipping through our fingers. His body seemed to collapse inward, his outline growing fainter, until, poof, he was gone, vanished into the very walls of the house. We cried out his name, desperate, but the echo of our voices dissolved before it could even reach us. The house, as if it had never known him, consumed him completely. He was never there, not truly. He was erased. A sickening realization dawned in me, slow and dreadful. The house was feeding on us, on our very existence. With every passing moment, it devoured our presence, drawing us deeper into its empty folds, erasing us from time itself. We had been here before, I was certain of it, but now we were fading, vanishing without a trace. The house was rewriting us, turning us into little more than fleeting memories. A violent, desperate urge to escape surged within me. I turned toward the door, but it wasn't there. The hallway stretched endlessly, twisting in on itself. The exit, the very path I had followed into this place, was now an illusion. The door was gone. And with it, my hope of leaving. I could feel the walls closing in, suffocating me, erasing me like a forgotten dream. I awoke in a room so cold that it seemed to crawl beneath my skin, making the marrow in my bones ache with a deep, gnawing emptiness. The mansion had changed, or perhaps it was I who had changed. The walls pressed in tighter, the corners more distant, the floors more unfamiliar. The air, once thick with the oppressive weight of memories, now hung silent, still, as though the house itself had ceased to breathe. The faces of my companions, once so vivid in my mind, had begun to dissolve, like mist carried away by the wind. I tried to remember them, tried to summon the warmth of their voices, the sound of their laughter, but the images slipped away like fragments of a forgotten dream. I was alone. There was no Thomas, no Margaret, no William. No traces of their presence remained, and yet I could feel them, lingering, faint echoes, whispers lost to the walls. Had they ever truly been here? The question gnawed at me like the steady tick of a clock, but there was no answer, just the hollow emptiness that filled the space where their memories should have been. I stumbled through the halls, feeling my very thoughts begin to fray at the edges, like pages torn from an ancient book. I sought something, anything, that might tether me to a world outside these suffocating walls. I needed to know who I was, who they had been. But no matter where I looked, I found nothing. It was then that I found the mirror. I had seen it before, but it hadn't been important. Now, it drew me to it with a compulsion I could not resist. I stared into its surface, expecting the reflection of the man I once was. But there was nothing, nothing at all. My face was gone, my form erased, as though I had never existed in the first place. There was only the reflection of the room, distorted and stretched like a darkened void, but no trace of me. And in that moment, the truth came crashing down upon me. A realization so deep, so awful, that I could scarcely breathe. I had never left this place. I had always been here. I was one of the forgotten ones, an empty name scratched out in a ledger, a fleeting shadow in a house that devours all memory. I had been swallowed whole, consumed by this place until there was nothing left, nothing but the hollow echo of who I might have been. Outside, I thought I heard voices, strangers, their words drifting through the cracks of the house like leaves caught in the wind. They spoke in hushed tones, whispering the legend of the mansion, the stories of those who had vanished. Their voices were cold, distant, and their words were not kind. They did not mention me. They did not remember me. In the corner of the room, covered in a layer of dust and time, I found a photograph, a fading image of myself and my friends. The edges were curled, the faces blurred and indistinct, as though they had never truly existed, as if their forms were as ephemeral as smoke. The photograph was not a memory, but a lie, a cruel reminder that we had never been. I stared at the image, and the reality of it struck me with terrible clarity. I was a name erased. A face forgotten. I have always been here, and no one will ever remember me.